Welcome back, everybody, to the Hills Are Silent podcast. Tonight, those hills are extra quiet. Well, I do want to say a quick thank you to all of our new subscribers and followers. When Mitch and I started this podcast a few months ago, we're like, is anybody going to listen to this? Is anybody going to watch this? And then we got one subscriber. We're like, oh, there's a guy or a girl checking us out. So anyway, we just want to say thank you, everybody that's subscribed or is following us on Spotify podcasts or Spotify, whatever. We really appreciate it, and we'll try to give you guys the best show we can every week. And tell your friends, tell your buddies. Yeah, thanks for sticking around. We know you're out there.
Thank you.
Yeah,
we really appreciate it.
Anyway, without further ado, welcome back to the podcast where we chop it up about the games of yesterday, today, and some games from tomorrow as well. All right, y'all, let's get into it. All right, Mitch, I've got a game that I've been playing.
I say we're switching it up this time around. What are you playing, Mike? Not what am I playing yet. It's what are you playing today?
Well, funny thing is you've also been playing this game. So, I don't know, man. You and I, as we mentioned on our earlier episode, we're playing through A Way Out, which for those that don't know, A Way Out is a co-op only game. You cannot play the single player. You have to have a buddy. And that's made easier by the fact that only one person actually has to own a copy of this game. And then the second person can play for free with their friend who owns a copy of this game. So I thought that's pretty cool. We didn't do that. We actually both have a copy of this. But anyway, just thought I'd put that out there. So this was developed by Hazelight, and they're also known for another great cooperative shooter called It Takes Two, which is a completely different tone from this game. It Takes Two is more of like a Pixar kind of Disney style cartoonish game. And it's very long, by the way. And A Way Out is a more realistic, gritty game about two reluctant friends who meet in prison and plan to break out of prison and seek revenge on their common enemy that screwed them over while they both were before they went to prison. This is a much shorter game than Hazelight's other game, It Takes Two. I think we beat this like just shy of 5 hours, maybe 6 hours. I don't remember the exact time, but
yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, but for me, that was perfect. Like, this is sweet game. It's one of those games where there's no filler. They didn't pad the game out to make it longer. It was just like balls to the wall action from beginning to end. Story just constantly progressing. Just very interesting story. Some twists and turns. Definitely don't want to spoil it for you, so I won't go beyond the synopsis I just provided. But one cool thing about this game is when you're playing co-op, even if it's not couch co-op, even if it's over the internet, you're always seeing both people's screens. So it's still split screen, even if you're playing over the internet. And this is great because it gives you a view of the story from everyone's perspective. You get, even if you're just playing as one of the two characters, you still get the full experience of what each character is going through in this game. And there were some bombastic action sequences.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just the whole prison break part was so cool and clever in of itself. And after that, there's some really awesome chase sequences. My favorite being, actually, I can't even say my favorite. There was a couple that were like neck and neck. But one of the best chase sequences was when you are in a hospital to stop by and see one of the protagonist's wife who just had a baby And of course, you're on the run from the law, so that was a very risky move. Sure enough, the police show up, and there's this epic chase to get out of the hospital and away from the police trying to capture you. And there's these really cool scenes where for most of the game you're playing at the same time, but for this sequence it will show one character at a time, and so one of us will be in control. So Mitch's character would be escaping through some crazy thing, then there'd be some real cool shift where all of a sudden it shifts over to my character and he's escaping, and the whole time they're weaving in and out of this hospital, like just around each other but never in the same room. It was just very well done, and man, that must have taken a lot of time to plan that whole sequence and scene out.
Yeah, the transitions and the camera work were they were better than most games I've ever played, honestly. It was just that, especially that sequence in the hospital, like you said, was second to none. It was just so cool being able to transition between my character, then your character, and the whole time, like, it's like, okay, Mike, you're up, you got to go now. Then, next moment it's me, I got to go, defend myself for some guards or some folks trying to arrest us in the hospital. So yeah, that was wild.
Yeah. I highly recommend this game. I think everybody should check it out. It's not that expensive. I don't think it's on Game Pass, but right now.
So it is on Game Pass.
Oh, it is.
It is. That's how I was playing it.
Oh,
actually.
that's right. It is on Game Pass. Nice. Never mind.
Yeah, thanks to their partnership with EA, a lot of those EA Play games are now part of Game Pass.
Yeah, that's right. My only criticisms on the game they're not even actually criticisms. One thing is there's such beautiful level design, but you're going through the game at just a breakneck speed, so you don't really get a chance to take it all in, because whoever designed those levels put so much effort and detail into it, and you just want to stop and look at everything, but when you're being chased by the police, you don't really have time to do that.
Yeah, I have that noted down as well, hoping I figured you were going to cover that because it's something that we talked about during it, but I noted the same thing, that yeah, there's some beautiful areas that you only sit and look at for maybe one scene, and then we're on to something else.
Yeah. And with Hazelight, something I noticed in both this game and their other game that came out after this, It Takes Two, is there are occasionally some kind of goofy plot points, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, because even though the plot points are kind of goofy and they kind of make you go like, what, like who's writing this? At the same time, it was still very entertaining. Even the goofy parts, they're like unintentionally goofy in my opinion. But yeah, so it's kind of,
I've got that noted as well. That's funny. Yeah, we're pretty in lockstep with this game. Yeah, some of the scenarios are a bit ridiculous in there, and they definitely make you say this is a video game.
Yeah.
But it's fun the way they put it together, and it's not really a knock on the game. It's just it's some of the stuff that they kind of make more serious is somewhat funny just by the way I guess the events take place.
Yeah, but we had a great time. Maybe someday we'll play through this again. But yeah, so that's what I've been playing. Mitch, I think you've been doing more gaming than me this week. What do you have to talk about?
Yeah, I've been playing a couple games that I'm excited to talk about, and one in particular I think you have some experience playing, and the first one is Payday 2. And Payday 2 is a stealth cooperative shooter, I guess is kind of the way to say. You can go in. It's a bank robbing game. You're going through different types of heists. You're trying to make it out and collect as much money as possible. And you could do it through a multitude of ways. You can either go in guns blazing, which is kind of the harder way because they do throw a lot of enemies at you. Or you can go through what I prefer and my friends prefer, the stealthy option. And this game came out, I want to say, I didn't even note it down, but quite a while ago. Payday 2 came out.
2013. It's almost 10 years old at this point. Wow, that's crazy to think.
Yeah, and I was looking at my achievements because I was curious of when I bought the game, and I bought it in 2014. So I guess I wasn't. I was fairly new to it, but my friends and I were just kind of bored of the games we had been playing lately and our go-tos, and we're like, why not just fire up Payday 2 again and see how it is? And honestly, it still holds up really well for a game that's came out almost 10 years ago, and they've added a ton of content to it since the last time I played. It's funny, some of the new heists that they've partnered with a lot of people. It's kind of been popular now in today's age to partner with different games and kind of mix games together. You know, Fortnite obviously brings in a lot of other properties to their game, but Payday 2 did the same, and they have a kind of a few fun heists that I may purchase so my friends can play it. They've got a goat simulator heist, which is interesting. I don't know how exactly that works, but I'd be interested in that one. A Scarface heist, and then a John Wick heist. So some pretty cool properties that they partnered with to put some content into the game.
Now, I do have a question about that. So, yeah, I used to play this game pretty heavily around when it first came out. And yeah, I know they've been releasing just tons of additional heists and DLC over the years. This game has been supported by the developers just for years and years and years now. It's so much more to the game than it was when it first released. And I know at the beginning, a lot of the DLC and heists were paid DLC, but they have released some free stuff. Is all the stuff you mentioned, like the Scarface DLC and the John Wick DLC, is that all paid DLC?
It is all paid DLC, but I did look to see how much if I bought everything that they've released. They have a legacy collection, I guess, now that's just all their DLC thrown together. And I would have had to pay $17 for everything.
Oh, wow.
Which I think
that's really, really reasonable.
Yeah, that's just a drop in the bucket. I feel like I'm pretty tempted just to spend that, because the cool thing about it is if one person has the heist unlock, all your friends can play it with you.
Oh,
So not everybody has to buy it.
that's awesome.
Essentially, yeah, I think it's great. You just have to be the lobby leader, and you have to invite your friends into the heist, and then they can play it. They don't have to own the DLC. But just a little more detail into what Payday 2 is. It is a bank robbing game. It is very cut and dry of going into certain banks, or I kind of want to lay out a scenario though, just to maybe break down for people that are interested. With some friends and I that just played a recent one the other day. So we only go in stealth. We do not. Our friends will not do. Once we get caught and they make you put your mask on and go guns blazing, we start over, because it's not as fun. It's not as fun for me to do run and gun in that sort of game. I like the stealth option. But for one that we did, we were invading the White House, and we went to the White House, and we had to essentially cut these specific wires and not get cut or not get caught. And once we cut these specific wires, we would get a key card, and then a key card would open a secret door in the White House that we could use to get into a vault and steal a bunch of money. And then our goal was to get all those bags of money and get it out of the White House into our getaway vehicle. And the cool thing about like the game is it's interesting, and where if you do get caught, you have options to take out the people that are catching you before they radio in an alarm that essentially ends your run almost if you don't start going guns blazing. So you can take people out stealthily pretty quickly, but you only have 4 people you can take out total before you're automatically caught. So essentially, once you take one out, you have to answer the person's radio, and you have to pretend that you're the person on the radio when somebody's calling in saying, hey, is everything okay down there, or whatever. And you only get 4 of those. And so after you lose all 4 of those, they no longer believe you on the radio. And then they sign the alarm, and then you're caught. So it's been kind of fun with my friends and I yelling at each other when one of them gets caught and being like, dude, we only got 3 left, man. Like you can't just be getting caught like that. You got to take your time. So it's a lot of patience with the game, but I think the stealth option is the way to go. I'm not sure. Did you play with any other friends, or are you kind of rolling by yourself on that one?
Yeah, it was me and my buddy Anthony that were obsessed with this game for a period of time. And I mean, we were the opposite. Typically, we like to go loud. Not all the time though, because it's it's actually much harder to go loud and go guns blazing. So eventually, if you're going guns blazing, you can only get to a certain difficulty level because you can go into heists and then crank up the difficulty. I think the maximum is like overkill
Yeah.
difficulty or something like that. And it's impossible, it seems, to do overkill without doing stealth because once you sound the alarms, it's like the whole freaking army is bursting down the doorstep to take you out, and there's just no way you can survive through it.
Yeah,
So
it's almost like a Left 4 Dead flood, but with a SWAT team. They just keep sending people at you, man. Just
yeah,
hordes of people coming at you.
yeah, that's actually a really good comparison. And yeah, the longer you take after you sounded the alarm, the bigger, more lethal enforcements they send at you to stop you. And a lot of the heists are really clever. And I don't know, did you ever play Payday 1?
No, I actually only started with Payday 2 because I built my computer in 2013 or 14 and literally just jumped into Payday 2 right away.
I think I played Payday 1 maybe very, very briefly. But yeah, it was Payday 2 that really hooked me. And yeah, but yeah, once you get to those higher difficulty levels, you basically have to stealth it. There's no other way. And those higher difficulty levels give you a bigger payout. So eventually you're incentivized to, okay, we can't keep going loud. We have to really play this strategically. And another thing that's really cool about this game is years down the line, the developers eventually added a VR mode to it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was years later. It was they added an update that added VR, and it's really, really cool experiencing the game from the VR perspective. But the problem I had is I loved playing it in VR, but my buddies would want to put it on a high difficulty level, would want to go loud, and I'm like, guys, you don't understand it. Like, I physically have to do all this stuff. I have to open the vault, pick up the bags of money, reload my gun. Like, I am like dripping in sweat trying to actually act out these heists in VR when my buddies are just laying back in the chair on the couch just going through it on the computer. I'm like, dude, everything you do, every little move your character makes is like actually me physically doing it, burning calories, getting worn out. It was so overwhelming and stressful. I just kept telling them, like, guys, we got to put it on a lower difficulty level. We got to go stealth. You're killing me over here. I'm trying to enjoy this in VR. So really, if you do play it in VR mode, you're going to have to either have very understanding friends that are willing to play it on easy, or all of you have to be in VR.
Yeah, I think I found a good weight loss option for me then. Might have to get a VR so I can seems like a lot of fun to lose weight in that aspect.
Yeah, it's really cool. At some point I'm gonna jump back in, do some more VR in Payday 2.
Yeah, before we move on, I do want to touch on one other thing because you talked about the money aspect and like getting the money, and it is fun. There's a lot of depth in what you can get with the money, and one of my favorite things to go and purchase, and you can customize your guys' masks, and they have so many mask options now. It's insane to me. But my friend Drew was dressed. He had a mask of George H.W. Bush, which I thought was just the funniest thing ever. Like, you can go from having George H.W. Bush to my other friend Nate had like a skull with like a Monopoly top hat on. Like, it was like, some of them are just ridiculous looking. I had a dog or like a rabid dog mask or something like that, and it's cool just looking at your friends as you're like trying to like stealth around a mission, just looking ridiculous with these masks on. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of depth to it, and there's a ton of heist now. So it's like there's just a lot of great content, and it's just a fun game to boot. So and then along with that, they did announce Payday 3, which is they show on Steam it's a 2023 release date, but I won't hold my breath on it. But uh, it is coming at some point.
Interesting. I'll be looking out for that. I could have sworn that Starbreeze Studios went out of business, so I'm really surprised that a Payday 3 is in development.
I did like it just maybe a couple months ago announced and threw out a trailer and some stuff in a reserve page on Steam. So I'm not sure if it's under the same development or if they gave it to somebody else, but would be interesting to know. I don't have my Steam up at the moment.
We'll see. Yeah, the studio's created some other games. One of them being Raid World War II. And that was a pretty hotly anticipated game because they're coming off of the success of Payday 2. But that game was not very good. It was kind of similar gameplay style, and it took place in World War II. But yeah, I couldn't get into that one. And it's got a mixed reception on Steam, and I think a way smaller player base.
I know my friend has been playing. He's the one who got us into getting back into Payday 2, and he'd been playing by himself. And he said he's had no problem getting into heists with random people whenever he wants. So I guess Payday 2 still has a good player base, which is awesome to see.
Oh, yeah. Cool, man. I'm glad you brought this game up because it brings back so many memories for me. I mean, like all of 2014, this was basically the only game I was playing. So at some point I should jump back in, especially with all these new heists. And I had bought in the Legacy Collection, but I'm sure that they've released even more DLC since then. So that version was probably behind on some of the DLC releases. And fun fact, there's multiple releases of Payday 2 as far as physical copies go. Now, and there's like the regular Payday 2 version. There's like a special edition that had all the DLC up until the point that was released. And then they had, I think, an Overkill edition, which at the time of its release had all of the DLC. So if you were wanting to buy this game as a physical copy, the Overkill edition would be the one that comes with all the DLC, or at least as much as you're going to get in a physical release. But having said that, like one of the main incentives for me for owning physical copies of things so I can play it forever and ever, but the fact that Payday 2 is a multiplayer focused game, you decide to bust this out on your ancient PlayStation 4 30 years from now for some nostalgia. You're not going to have as much fun because, as I mentioned, it's a multiplayer focused game. And even though you can play this game in single player with computer AI players as your teammates, it is almost impossible to beat any heists with just the AI controlled allies.
Yeah, I get pissed off enough of my friends who do dumb stuff that to get them caught. I can't imagine trying to coach their direct some CPUs through a heist.
Yeah. Cool, man. I'm gonna have to hop back in on this game at some point.
Yeah, I'll definitely join you now that I'm back into it. It'd be fun to run a couple heists ourselves.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, that's Payday 2. I have been playing one other game, and I have talked about it on the pod before, but that was only when I really scratched the surface of the game, and I wanted to give it its full due, as I am now pretty close to beating the game, actually, and it is called Hi-Fi Rush. And Hi-Fi Rush, as I've talked about one of our previous pods, it was a surprise release from the Xbox Bethesda Direct. They announced it. Nobody'd ever heard of the game, and they announced it during the Direct and then said it was released on the day of the Direct. and I gave it a try and really enjoyed it when I had started that. I was playing something else at the time, so I didn't dive into it after I gave it a trial run. But once I finished Chained Echoes is what I was playing, I decided, you know what, I'm going to give this a full run. I'm going to get through the whole thing, and I am so glad that I've stuck with it, because it's probably my favorite game I've played so far this year, and that's saying something coming from me also playing Harry Potter, Hogwarts Legacy recently. So just to kind of reiterate what I've talked about during the last pod, if people haven't listened, it's a rhythm action game that's developed by Tango Gameworks. And Tango Gameworks is known for creating the Evil Within series, Ghostwire Tokyo, and a few other titles. But essentially, it's a very linear game, which I appreciate. I was kind of looking for that after I've been playing a lot of RPGs lately. And it's a linear action game that kind of reminds me almost of a Devil May Cry, or maybe like a Bayonetta of some sort, where after every level or every portion of a level, you do get a grade for how well you did, and they grade you based on 3 factors: how fast you beat the level or the portion of the level every time you get into battle with some robots, how much you stayed on beat. So staying on beat is super important in this game. There's always a music going along in the background, and you do more damage if you stay on beat. So your attacks are always, you have an X, which is your light attack, and your Y, which is a heavy attack. And your X attacks, you basically swing to the beat faster, and your Y attack, that's a heavy attack, you swing to the beat a little slower. But you combine the two and make combos similar to those Devil May Cry games and those Bayonetta games. So that you also get graded on how much you, or how on beat you are through the sequence. And then the third factor is essentially your score, and you get more score based on being on beats and doing combos that you can unlock throughout the game. So you combine the light attacks and the heavy attacks and jumping and dodging, and you can create so many combos that remind me of, you know, the Bayonettas and the Devil May Cries. So when I play those games, I don't know about you, Mike, if you played any Devil May Cries or Bayonetta, but I sometimes get frustrated when I suck grade wise. Like if you know that the level ends and they're like, you got a D, you suck. Like, you know, you do. While you cleared this game, you obviously have no idea what you're doing. But in Hi-Fi Rush, I grade okay, and also I don't feel pressured to do super well because the game itself is just, it's just a great atmosphere that they've provided throughout the game. And I've gotten through most of it. I think I'm on chapter 9, and there's 12 chapters. And there's some super clever things that I don't see in a lot of games, and they really use like the whole be on beat, you know, go with the music, whole niche of their game really well. So there's times where like I faced a couple bosses or a couple like bigger robots. You're always fighting robots in the game because you're essentially trying to escape a robot factory. And so the bosses or these big robots will, after you do a certain amount of damage to them, they will stop and they will hit you with a big attack, and then there will be a prompt on the screen, and it'll be a little beat. Like you'll just see a bunch of little like notches on a beat, and essentially you have to block to the beat. And if you block correctly to the beat, then you can dish out like a big counter attack that takes them out. So it basically freezes the whole game, and it just gives you a nice little beat, and then you have to block to it. And I thought it was a super clever idea. It added like a different element that I wasn't expecting. And so it's little things like that, and they throw all these different mechanics in that I wasn't expecting, that I thought were super clever. And I'm typically not a rhythm game guy in general, but this really roped me in. And I think the final thing I'll say about it, I've enjoyed this a lot. I could talk about it for a long time, but it has really funny dialogue. And I didn't expect, it seemed when I watched the preview during the Xbox Direct, it might have been a little too self-aware of what it was, and sometimes that gets annoying to me. but while it is self-aware of what it is, and it does kind of make some corny jokes, but there are a lot of like jokes and a lot of humor within the game that are pretty clever, and I thought kind of funny. So for example, there was a robot talking to another robot, and there's a lot of them. They all have their different jobs within the factory, within the company that they're forced to work in. There's a robot that's saying he's tired and he's sick and he can't work any longer. And then there's another robot next to him saying, "Hey, dude, we can't feel those type of emotions. So you just got to keep working, man. I don't know what you're talking about." And then there's another one. There's a bunch of cleaning robots throughout the levels. They're always cleaning, and they're super self-aware that all they can do is clean. So you can see some of them like humming along to themselves how much they love cleaning and how much they rather not do anything else in the world. And the one thing that I posted on our Instagram that I did want to mention, there were some fun cameos in it. As I said, Tango Gameworks, they created The Evil Within and The Evil Within 2. And Sebastian and Oda from The Evil Within are in Hi-Fi Rush in robot form. And I thought I would only run into them one time and see, oh, that's kind of clever, like that, they put them in there and I found a little Easter egg. But no, they actually have a ton of dialogue, and you see them throughout like almost every level of the games talking about something, doing something, and it basically acting like they do in The Evil Within, where they're trying to take down a corporation similar to what I'm trying to do in Hi-Fi Rush. So all in all, just a super clever game, super charming. The art style is great, the dialogue is great, the gameplay is really fun, even with with the staying on beat all the time to get more points and to get a better score. It didn't seem to bother me as much as other games that do the similar thing. So it's been my favorite game this year. It's on Xbox Game Pass. If you have it, I highly recommend giving it a try.
I'm gonna have to check it out. You had me at Devil May Cry and Bayonetta, because those are like two of my favorite action series of all time. And I love music, so I don't know. This may be like the perfect combination of the game for me.
I will say it doesn't. The combat probably isn't as smooth as a Devil May Cry, because they have some pretty tight mechanics in those Devil May Cry games.
Yeah.
But it's pretty darn good for what it is, and the music's really good. They have some actually licensed music in it, like the Black Keys is in it. I'm trying to think of who else is in it. There's a couple other.
I saw they said 9 Inch Nails, which, man, 9 Inch Nails has been around forever and making music for games forever. I mean, going all the way back to the original Doom from the early 90s, and they're still at it.
Yep.
I mean, at this point, I don't know. I haven't looked up 9 Inch Nails for a long time, but it could just be Trent Reznor now, the front man. I don't know if he still actually has a full band.
I know they were at Riot Fest maybe 2 years ago. I don't know.
Oh yeah.
Who of 9 Inch Nails was there, but the band 9 Inch Nails, they said, was theirs.
Okay, nice. Yeah, and Hi-Fi Rush being on Game Pass, I mean, that just sweetens the deal. So I already am able to play it since I got Game Pass. So I mean, I gotta check it out.
Yeah, it's the only reason I tried it in the first place, and that's why the service I will continue to preach until they give us a sponsorship of some sort.
Yeah, for real. I'll take a lifetime subscription to Game Pass any day.
Yeah,
Microsoft.
not asking much. Not asking much.
All right, man. Well, that's pretty awesome. Now, I think you stumbled upon some news regarding Tango Gameworks.
I did, yeah. I thought it was really great that I got to highlight Hi-Fi Rush, because it really led into this other story that just came out this week. And the famed game developer Shinji Mikami, he's very well known for directing the original Resident Evil, The Evil Within, is leaving Tango Gameworks after 13 years.
The studio that he founded, mind you.
Yes, yeah. Very important to note. So I think he had been taking kind of a backseat role in some of the as far as I know, he's been there for 13 years, but I don't think he's been as hands-on with a lot of the games as he has prior to, and especially during his time with The Evil Within, the original, the first one. because I did note that with the Evil Within 2, he did not direct that one, which might actually say something as to why we were not very thrilled with the Evil Within 2.
Oh yeah.
In general, it was not. It just didn't have the same. I don't know. It didn't have the same vibe as the Evil Within 1, which now that kind of makes sense. But Bethesda, they released a tweet on their verified account just thanking him, wishing him well. They didn't say anything that he plans to do next. I'm wondering if he eventually starts another studio of some sort. I was reading a little more into this guy, and it seems like he's someone who doesn't like to direct sequels in general. Which it does kind of line up though, because he didn't do a ton with Resident Evil after the original Resident Evil, and then obviously with the Evil Within, he did not direct the sequel to that one. But along with that, I was kind of I was looking at some Reddit posts. I wanted to see what other people had to say about it, and apparently, from looking at some of these posts, he rejected an offer from Capcom to work on the Resident Evil 4 remake, which I thought was interesting. He declined working on that to stay at Tango, but then he eventually left Tango in general. But I thought that was an interesting nugget that he declined to work on that remake.
Yeah, that is interesting. So I just pulled up his all the games that he's worked on in his career. And as you mentioned, he directed the very first original Resident Evil. He was a producer on Resident Evil 2. Then after that, he was a director and producer on Dino Crisis, which I love that game. And then he was a producer on Resident Evil 3, Resident Evil Code Veronica, an executive producer on Dino Crisis 2. Let's see what else. Yeah, he had a lot of supervisor or advisor, producer roles in a lot of the early great Resident Evil games. He was an executive producer on Devil May Cry, so that could be why Hi-Fi Rush is very similar to Devil May Cry.
Yeah.
Wow, he worked on Steel Battalion on the original Xbox. That was an interesting game.
I think you going over those almost proves, or I guess kind of feeds into the rumor or assumption from some people that he doesn't like to direct sequels, because it seems like the only director roles that he has there are original games or the first game in the series.
Yeah, and it looks like he also directed the remake of the original Resident Evil, which, man, that was amazing. Let's see here. Also was a director and writer on the original Resident Evil 4. So I forgot about that. So that's probably why they asked him to come take part in the remake that's coming out.
Yeah.
And is executive producer on Beautiful Joe, which is a good game.
Oh, that's a great one.
Killer 7 was an executive producer and writer. Oh, wow. Okay, he directed God Hand, which, for those of you that don't know, God Hand is a not very well-known PlayStation 2 beat-em-up game that is very unique, and it's actually a pretty cool game. And then he also directed Vanquish, which I freaking loved. Vanquish. It's a third-person shooter, very action-oriented, over-the-top. Wow. Creative producer on Shadows of the Damned. I really didn't care for that game, but I know a lot of people love that game. And then, as you mentioned, he directed The Evil Within, then an executive producer on The Evil Within 2, Ghostwire Tokyo, and Hi-Fi Rush. So, I mean, what a prolific career. Like, these are all so many great games, many of which I've played. I mean, about at least 80% of his entire game catalog I've played and loved every last one of those games. So this man is a true icon and gem to the gaming industry. Yeah. So I hope he goes on to do more games, because I mean, he's an extremely talented individual that I don't want to lose. I want him to just keep making these amazing games that I've enjoyed throughout my life.
Yeah, some very clever ideas. And going back to my Reddit threads, I did see one that I really agreed with. Somebody wanted him to eventually go back and help with the Code Veronica remake, which I know a lot of people have been clamoring for. So that would be pretty cool.
Yeah. I was hoping that the next remake for Resident Evil that they were gonna do, that Capcom was gonna do, was gonna be Code Veronica. I kind of saw it coming that it was going to be Resident Evil 4 because even though Code Veronica did well for its time, it's not remembered and it wasn't the game changer, pun intended, that Resident Evil 4 was. So I'm like, man,
Sure.
please don't skip Code Veronica. I mean, I know y'all are going to eventually do a remake for Resident Evil 4, but please just do the Code Veronica one first, then move on to the Resident Evil 4 one. But alas, the Resident Evil 4 one is what we're getting next. Which I'm also looking forward to that, but I just worry that they're going to skip over Code Veronica and we're never going to get that amazing remake that game could be.
Absolutely.
So, speaking of Resident Evil, both Mitch and I have played many of the Resident Evil games, and that's one of my favorite game franchises of all time. And Code Veronica is one of my favorite Resident Evil games. It's pretty much neck and neck between Resident Evil Code Veronica and Resident Evil 2. Depending on what day you ask me, it's going to be one or the other. And for me, those are the top Resident Evils. And even the Resident Evil 2 remake is right up there as well, because that was everything I could have wanted in a remake of Resident Evil 2, one of my favorite games of all time. So that's at the top of my list. Mitch, what's been your favorite Resident Evil game?
So I will admit I haven't played as many as you have. I've yet to give the Resident Evil 2 remake a go, which I've heard wonderful things about it. I've heard that
you gotta play it, man. You gotta play. It's so scary too. It is so scary. I was playing it in the dark, screaming like a little girl every time some zombie popped around the corner.
I know. Once I finish Hi-Fi Rush, I have the disc out. I've packed all my games away, and I've left one disc out, and it is Resident Evil 2 remake.
Yeah.
And so, whether if it's when I move or if it's when I'm still in my current apartment, it is my next game that I play while I mix in some Hogwarts Legacy.
Naturally.
Yes, I mean that one's a pretty long one too, though. So I need to play some linear games while I'm making my way through Hogwarts. But from what I have played, and I like Resident Evil 2, the original, a lot as well. But the one that's probably an unpopular opinion that I keep going back to, and I have a lot of love for now, is Resident Evil 7. And I don't know what it exactly is about Resident Evil 7. I think I'm super just impressed by them taking a swing and doing something different. And this is the start of them doing something different than they usually did with the Resident Evil series, and switching it over to first person and keeping the Resident Evil roots and as far as the gameplay is concerned. But it just felt fresh to me, and they nailed it. And I was kind of like you said with Resident Evil 2, how scared you were. There's a lot of moments in Resident Evil 7 where I was like jump scared like crazy. And I think that has a lot to do with just the characters that they created within that game. Like the whole thing at the beginning where the father in Resident Evil 7 just goes, "Welcome to the family, son," and like boom, you're right into that game. Like it just something about it was just super creepy. That the story was really good, and yeah, I don't know, the gameplay itself was a lot of fun. The shooting felt good. It was just a different swing that they had. They knew after Resident Evil 6 they needed to do something different. It didn't perform as well as, past Resident Evils had, and they honestly nailed it. And I think just along the lines of that, I'm super impressed with it. And I think one other thing I'd like to say about it is their DLC. Like they actually put a lot of care into that DLC, and I went back and played it probably a year ago. And every DLC for me, for the most part, like the main ones that they created, hit for me, and they were all super different and awesome in their own way. Like there's one where you take, you know, Chris Redfield and you uh go back into the campaign, and essentially instead of being Ethan, you're Chris Redfield, and you're cleaning up the mess of the aftermath of when you escape with Ethan. But and there's another one where you're one of the uncles of the family who is trying to work his way through and save another family member. So it, seven just it just hit for me for in all the right ways, and it currently is my number one, for at least for the moment, until I dive into that 2 remake.
Yeah, I really enjoyed 7 as well. It was very different, which initially was jarring to me, but I'm glad they went back to their horror roots, because Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6, they were getting farther and farther away from scary and just more towards an action game. And although I enjoyed those games, they just didn't feel like Resident Evil games. They felt like spin-offs that took place in the Resident Evil universe. And then when Resident Evil 7 got back to the horror roots, and it actually was very, very scary. And one thing that really helps with that is the game engine that they have now for these Resident Evil games, the RE engine, which is what they made 7 on, 8 on, the remakes 2 and 3. That is an incredible game engine. The graphics are really good. It helps sell the atmosphere, and they run flawlessly on even lower spec computers and the consoles. I played through all the DLC as well that you mentioned. DLC was great on Resident Evil 7. And even now, just looking at the footage and some of the screenshots, I had forgotten a lot about this game. And yeah, there were just some truly spooky moments and unique moments as well. A lot of things in games and movies is just rehashes of what's already been done. And yeah, Resident Evil 7 definitely has some inspiration from other things from horror. I mean, namely like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You definitely see
Definitely
the influence from that. But even beyond that, it was very scary in these weird other scenarios that I'd never experienced before. And yeah, towards the end, where they, first of all, I'm like, what does this have to do with Resident Evil? Because at the beginning, they don't mention the Umbrella Corporation. They don't mention anything from the previous games. And it isn't until much later on in the game that they start tying in the Umbrella Corporation and all the other Resident Evil lore and how it relates to this family out in the swamps. And there's a VR mode, which to this day I am too scared to play. That just sounds terrifying to me to play this in VR.
I've heard wonderful things about that VR mode too within that game, but I'm like you. There's no way I go into that.
Whew. Getting scared just thinking about that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so what if that's your favorite Resident Evil? What is your least favorite Resident Evil?
Yeah, I know this is a disagreement with you as we've talked off the pod about this, but my least favorite is Resident Evil 6. And I think you kind of touched on the reasons why I didn't like it when you were talking about 4, 5, and 6 and how they really strayed. Oh, they went away from horror, which is, you know, when I play a Resident Evil, that's really what I want. I want the spooks. I want to be terrified. I want to be on my couch with the lights off and, you know, nervous to turn the corner or whatnot. And I feel like Resident Evil 6 just didn't hit for me in any way. I actually played through it really recently. This year I want to, or maybe the end of last year. So pretty recently I played through this with my streamer friend Xenofox. Shout out to her if she's listening to this podcast. But you and I played through one campaign together years ago. I want to say, man, I was living in my first apartment out of college, but then I finished the rest of the campaigns just recently. and none of them just really captured me in any way, made me feel like I was playing even a Resident Evil game for that matter. It felt almost like a random third person shooter that I didn't really, I don't know, it didn't really hit for me. And I don't know if it was because of the Steam version I was playing, but it was also very buggy, and there was a lot of quick time events that were incredibly difficult for no reason that we had to keep restarting, and that was a bit annoying. I know QTEs are a thing with a lot of the Resident Evil games lately, but for that one in particular, it was unnecessarily hard. And I guess my only other thing is that a lot of the characters in that game were pretty bland and just not fun to converse with, or like the Leon campaign, or it was probably the better of the bunch that we played together. But the ones after that, they just didn't really do much for me. I want to hear your thoughts on that one though, because you liked it more than I did, and I guess I want to hear what were the pros for you.
Yeah, well, it's definitely not the best of the Resident Evil series, and like you said, mainly due to the fact that it did not play like any prior Resident Evil game. It was just an action third-person shooter that happened to have Resident Evil characters in it. I did enjoy it. I know a lot of people didn't. It definitely has its flaws, and for those who have not played it, what Mitch was referring to as far as campaigns is this game, the scale of this game was huge. Capcom set out to make just Resident Evil 4 did really well, and then Resident Evil 5 did even better. That was their best-selling Resident Evil game, and I think at that point probably was one of the best-selling games, or was the best-selling game Capcom ever had. So they had the bar set really high for Resident Evil 6, and they just wanted to go all out. So they had this idea of making multiple single-player campaigns. So you'd have an entire campaign where you played as Leon Kennedy, an entire campaign as Chris Redfield, an entire campaign as Albert Wesker's son, I can't remember the son's name, an entire campaign of Ada Wong, and all of these campaigns could be played in two-player co-op. Now, with Resident Evil games, I've always wanted to play co-op Resident Evil games. I'm like, that's the one thing the series was missing. I love playing through these games by myself. Playing it through with a friend would make it that much better. So I appreciated that they set out to make a campaign or a co-op game from the start. Now the problem is, I think Capcom bit off more than they could chew, and you can definitely tell when they started running out of steam or running out of a budget because yeah, the Leon Kennedy campaign was probably the strongest of all of them, and then next in line would probably maybe be the Chris Redfield campaign.
Yeah.
But that leaves the Albert Wesker's son's campaign and the Ada Wong campaign suffered the most. I mean, that almost seems like it was unfinished.
Jake is his name. Jake Wesker.
Jake Wesker, yeah. So
I couldn't think of it, and I just played it.
So I think they put most of their resources towards Leon's campaign and Chris's campaign, and the other two, especially Ada Wong's, like they ran out of money, ran out of time, ran out of ideas, had to ship the game. So I would advise anybody to just completely, if you want to go back and play this, just skip Ada Wong's campaign and maybe Jake Wesker's as well, and just play Leon's. If you like it, also play Chris's, but then after that, consider yourself beating the game.
No, but I totally agree with you there, just because there are a lot of times, especially with Wesker's campaign, that you are actually just doing things in a different perspective than you would have. You're essentially in the same area that you were with like either Leon or with Chris, but you're just in a different perspective and doing a different action in the same exact setting. Because there's sometimes where they all come together and they're doing something, and so if you do Leon and you do Chris, I think that pretty much sets you up for everything that you need to see in that game.
Yeah.
And then along with Ada's campaign, my friend Zeno and I, we did it co-op, and she was Ada. And I thought the funny thing is they didn't have somebody that she was with, so I was just some random masked man that was like an agent or some sort and had no name. He wasn't in any of the cutscenes. he was just kind of tagging along, and you didn't even know who the heck he was, which I thought that was kind of funny.
Yeah. Again, you can tell that campaign was unfinished, and that was the one I had the most bugs with. You mentioned running into
Same.
bugs on the Steam version. The Ada one was so buggy, that campaign. Yeah, I think it was me and my buddy Anthony that played through that as well, and we had to like force ourselves to finish the Ada campaign just so we can say we beat the whole game. But anyway, yeah, I did enjoy the Leon campaign a lot. It started out strong. The story and the opening action sequences were pretty bombastic. The control scheme, there's a lot to the controls. So a lot of third-person shooters are very simple, but this one, man, there's so many. I don't know how they got so many different maneuvers and stuff on the limited controller buttons. But like you can shoot, do dives, rolls, and then when you dive, you can lay down on the ground, shoot, and then scoot away. Like it's crazy, like how much stuff you can do. And then there's like these melee attacks you can do that are pretty cool. So it's a bit overwhelming at first, but once you really get down packed the controls, you can do some crazy, funky, fancy stuff while fighting all these monsters. And one thing I did like about the game is the enemies, especially in Leon's campaign. There's some really cool enemies you go up against, and while you're killing them, they evolve. It kind of reminded me of Gears of War 3, where like you'd shoot the enemies and then eventually they just grow into something even bigger, and then they'd have a different weak point you'd have to shoot. And so I definitely like the concept of evolving monsters as you're battling them, and I don't think enough games do that, because that really kept Gears of War 3 interesting. And for me, it's Resident Evil 6. Yeah, you blow somebody's head off, and then they would just turn into some even bigger, more menacing foe. So
I will give you. Sorry, not to cut you off.
Go
But
ahead.
I will give you that though. That the way when you're shooting people, I know we've talked about it in the past. I want my shooting to feel good. You know, I want to feel good killing some enemy, and Resident Evil 6 did do a good job of that, with as far as like when you're shooting these things and they're evolving, they're spraying everywhere, they're freaking out, they're evolving. Like that was cool to see. So I will give them credit for at least like the shooting felt good, as much as it didn't have the horror aspect. It did nail the third person shooter aspect. And going back, one other thing to where you said it was like the cutscenes were cool. There was a lot of explosions and big things happening. The running joke of some of my friends that I played it with it's kind of like Michael Bay meets Resident Evil.
Yeah.
Where like it's just obnoxious explosions everywhere and just all this stuff is happening, and it doesn't really need to be, but it looks really cool.
Yeah. But yeah, and also the first couple, like I said, the first two campaigns, it kept being fresh stuff, and then eventually the tables turned and it started becoming watered down, because again, I think they bit off more than they could chew, trying to create such an expansive game. But one thing I like in games is when there's a lot of different enemy types with very different mechanics, and I think that's a big draw to the Souls-like games like Dark Souls and Elden Ring and stuff, is that you're constantly encountering new foes that are completely different from each other. And there's a problem with a lot of games where they have very limited enemy types, and then the game becomes very boring because you're fighting the same enemies over and over again. So I did appreciate that throughout the campaigns there was always some new different threat, until you get to the Ada Wong campaign. I feel like I'm repeating myself at this point, but I enjoyed it. I would recommend it. I just wouldn't recommend anybody play through all 4 campaigns. Just play the better ones.
That's fair.
Enjoy it for what it is.
And do it in co-op. I feel like you'll have more fun if you have a friend doing it.
Oh yeah. I wouldn't even play this game a single player.
No.
Yeah, I think a lot of the fun is, again, the company you keep. You and I played through the Leon campaign, and then me and my buddy Anthony played through the other ones. And I'm pretty sure we were like super drunk playing through all those campaigns anyway. So that probably was why I have fonder memories than maybe what it really was.
There you go.
Anyway, my least favorite Resident Evil game, there's 2 choices that I have. And one of them I wouldn't even really consider it a worst Resident Evil game, and that is Resident Evil Gaiden, which was released for the Game Boy Color years and years ago. And for being a Game Boy Color game, it is actually very good. It's got its own story. It's full-blown Resident Evil campaign, interesting way of doing the combat. But again, you're on a very limited console. A Game Boy Color can only do so much. And the combat is interesting because you'll see the zombies on the map, and then when you run into them, it becomes like this mini game where you have a bar going left and right, and kind of like a golf game or something where you know the meter goes left and right, and you have to stop it just at the right time to get the perfect golf swing. Same here. If you stop at just the right time, you get a headshot on the zombie. Otherwise, you're either missing or just hitting a limb or something.
Interesting.
So that was a interesting way to do the combat and to kind of circumvent the limitations of the Game Boy Color. But I think it's more so that I just can't sit there and play a Game Boy Color game for hours on end. It wasn't worth it for me to finish it. So I'm not going to knock the game as much as I'm just going to knock the limitations of the hardware that it was released on. Anyway, lesser known Resident Evil game. I'd given it an honest chance a while back and just wasn't a fan. And wow, there's some good.
Your other one I'm interested to hear about because I do own this one and I plan on playing it eventually.
Okay, yeah. So the one that I would honestly say is my least favorite is Resident Evil Revelations 2. Now, I did play through the first Resident Evil Revelations, which is an interesting story because that started out as a Nintendo 3DS game. Or was it a Nintendo 2DS? I think it was 3DS.
I think it was Revelations 1 was a 2DS game, I think. Maybe.
Really?
Let me
I'm going to have to look this up. Because if it was a 2DS game, that's even more impressive. No, it was Nintendo 3DS.
Okay.
Anyway, I did not play it on 3DS, but this is a really cool game to be a 3DS game. And later on, Capcom ported the game to Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, which PlayStation 3 is where I actually played through the game. And other than a small graphical bump, I don't think much was changed from the 3DS game. So again, having played through it on PlayStation 3 and imagining it as a 3DS game, wow. Like seriously, that's an awesome handheld Resident Evil game. But it ran amazing on the PlayStation 3. I even dabbled in the multiplayer some, which it does have like a stripped down version of the campaign. Like you'll play sections of the campaign you can do in co-op, which is pretty cool, and they usually ends in a boss battle.
Okay.
So that was pretty fun too. And the game is presented in chapters, which is, I don't know. I sometimes I don't really care for that, but sometimes it can make a game kind of more like palatable as like bite-sized bits at a time. But I really enjoyed it. It was eventually re-released on PlayStation 4 and Xbox One as well, but I can't imagine there's really much of an upgrade from the Xbox 360 and PS3 version to the PS4 and Xbox One, because at the end of the day, it's still just a port of a Nintendo 3DS game. So it's
right.
Anyway, that was a great game. I liked it. It was unique. Still slightly had a horror vibe to it, but again was more of an action style game. And then eventually Resident Evil Revelations 2 was released for PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC. Actually, I think it was also released on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3.
Revelations 2, I believe so.
Yeah, so this was a wide release. Oh yeah, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, PC, Xbox 360, Xbox One. It also came out on PlayStation Vita, surprisingly.
Wow.
And Nintendo Switch. So this was on just about everything. It's also a co-op game. This one was actually released in chapters. So part 1 came out, and then like couple weeks or a month later, they came out with part 2, and then part 3, and then eventually it's kind of like the Walking Dead games, where you're getting like piecemealed out the different chapters.
Oh yeah, all those Telltale series.
Yeah, but I ended up buying this game after everything had come out, so I could just play through it. And I got it on PS4. Me and my buddy James played through it, and we just couch co-opted it. And it was good, but for the most part, it was pretty forgettable. It was kind of done like a Funhouse game, almost like, I guess that'd be the best way I could explain it. The levels weren't really realistic. Is more of like you're just kind of going through these crazy Funhouse type of scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of asymmetrical combat. So one person is always the one who has the guns and the one who can really do the combat, and then the second player is typically a more vulnerable player that plays more of a supporting role. And I really didn't care for that, because I was like, it's kind of like, who wants to get stuck with the weaker character? Like, during some levels you're playing as what's his name? I can't think of his name.
I was gonna ask if there's they're like main characters that are in the other Resident Evils in this one.
Yeah, the two main characters you play. Oh, Barry Burton. So the two main characters you play as are Barry Burton and Claire Redfield, and they're the ones that are like the main combat characters. And then when you're Barry Burton, the other player is a little girl that can't do any combat. All she can do is, I think, like, point out the enemies. She can like see them through walls and be like, hey, there's an enemy over there. And I think she can distract them with like rocks or something. And then she can get into areas that Barry can't get to like solve puzzles and open doors. So yeah, when me and James were playing, nobody really wanted to be the little girl because she was just kind of helpless. And then when you're playing as Claire Redfield, the other player is the daughter of Barry Burton, who for some reason has sworn off ever touching guns. So even though she's in a life-threatening situation with monsters, she refuses to pick up a gun. And she's limited to just melee weapons. So yeah, that kind of killed it for me. It's like, can't we just even it out? And can't we just both play characters with guns? Or yeah. So that's the main reason I still played through it all the way to the end. It wasn't bad, but it's not highly recommended to run through and play through it. Good talk, man. I always love talking about Resident Evil games.
I'm sure we'll have many more of those conversations as the podcast moves forward.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I can't wait to check out Resident Evil 4, the remake. Yeah, this was a long one. Sorry guys. We promise we're trying to keep them short and sweet for you, but there's just so much awesomeness out there. It's so hard.
Yep.
Anyway, thank you for tuning in. Thanks to anybody that made it all the way to the end of this podcast episode.
Extra thanks.
Can find our podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Mitch, give them the rundown on our social media presence.
Absolutely. You can find us on Twitter at The Hills Are Silent. Our Instagram is Instagram.com/Hills Are Silent. Our YouTube is, of course, The Hills Are Silent. And if you have our TikTok as well, can't forget the TikTok. We're going to be putting some more stuff on there here soon. Just bear with us. But that is The Hills Are Silent podcast. And if you have any questions or comments or game recommendations, as we've talked about, you can send them to our email inbox at hillsaresilent@gmail.com. We'll catch you in the next episode.